Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu filling in for Riz Khan. On today's show, the international superclass. Who are they, these global elites, and how much power and influence do they wield? Is it, as some believe, a shadowy group of men and women who constitute a secret world government? They are rich, influential and powerful, and they come from the world of business, of entertainment and even global charities and NGOs. Their rise to power in recent years owes much to the effects of globalization and the gradual reduction of trade and information barriers across the world. We'll be taking a look at them. Don't forget, we take your calls on the show, and the question we're asking today is, does the superclass make our governments and legal systems obsolete? You can reach us at the numbers there at the bottom of your screen. Our guests today are David Rothkopf, President and CEO of the consulting company Garten Rothkopf. He's also author of the newly published book, Superclass, the Global Power Elite and the World They're Making. Also with us, Jeff Faure, founder of the Economic Policy Institute, a think tank that seeks to broaden the public debate about strategies to achieve a prosperous and fair economy. He is the author of The Global Class War, How America's Bipartisan Elite Lost Our Future, and What Will It Take to Win It Back. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. David, let me start off with you. We talk about a superclass, the global power elite. Who are they?
Well, I defined it in the book as people who have the ability to influence millions of lives across borders on a regular basis. I wanted to get a group that was small enough that you could really look at it, see who they were and what, constituted them and the connections within them. Using that definition, we came up with almost 7,000 people, which in fact works out to one person in this group for every million people on the planet. But it's CEOs, it's heads of big financial institutions, heads of some governments, not all governments, because they don't all meet that criteria. It could be religious leaders, it could be scientific leaders, it could be actors, people who use their influence, though. So the superclass I'm defining isn't just rich people, it's people who have a hugely disproportionate share of global power.
So it's not just the rich, but people who can influence others. You've also included in your list someone like Osama bin Laden.
Well, that's a clear example of someone who, through their actions, is able to influence millions of lives across borders on a regular basis. Bin Laden has changed the way that the United States has viewed its foreign policy. It's changed, the course of international relations. It's changed the way we view civil liberties in the United States. And so, clearly there are lots and lots of impacts that he or Al-Qaeda have, and he falls into a category that I think is significant and growing, which I would call shadow elites, people who aren't part of the formal system and yet have power of a sort that may once have only been associated with, say, governments.
Jeff, in your book, you also talk about this elite group of people who exist in the world, but you're pretty critical of them. You say that the existence of this group has come at the cost to working people.
Yes, I think that's true. I think that when you have a national economy, you have class tensions, conflicts between labor and capital. But in a sense, that works out in a way that provides benefits for the people in the nation state. Years ago, back in the 1950s, we used to say what was good for General Motors was good for America. And while some people laughed at that, most people understood that that was true. Today, you can't say that, because what globalization has done is created an opportunity, not only in America, but for countries in countries around the world, for elites, business and economic elites especially, to break the bounds of the social contract. And so what you see around the world is that with globalization has come increasing inequality of income, wealth, and power.
And can that be reversed?
Well, it's going to take quite a struggle. It has to be reversed if we're going to preserve democracy, because what globalization has done has created a situation where elites can roam around the world, have freedom of investment, freedom of their own behavior, without the normal social constraints that you would have in a society and an economy. So it is a fundamental problem of globalization. It's a fundamental threat, I think, to our sense of democracy, and we are going to struggle with this for a long time to come.
Do you agree with that, David, that the superclass is necessarily a bad thing?
Well, look, what I'm defining as the nature of the global power structure, and some leaders are virtuous leaders. You know, there are people who've gotten to where they are by virtue of hard work, or they're doing good things with their power. The Gates Foundation does good things. You know, it puts as much money in the field to battle disease as the World Health Organization does. But I do agree with you know, one of Jeff's core points, which is that when you have enormously concentrated power and no balances, no checks for that power, as we do today on the global stage, that is a threat to democracy. Now, you know, then you get into a question of what do you do about it? And there are a couple of sets of solutions. And one set of solutions is, look, we have balances on the national stage. We don't have them yet on the global stage. So let's sort of pull back from the process of globalization and let's work within those balances until we can get them set up on the global stage. I think I come from a slightly different point of view, although I seek the same end, which is to say we need counterbalances on the global stage. We need things that will, you know, enable average people to influence the course of globalization in a way that they can't do it right now.
How different is the, well, let's say the current emergence of this superclass? I mean, the globalization is a relatively recent phenomenon. So how different is this new superclass from, say, the aristocratic class of the last century or the centuries before?
Well, there are lots of differences. I mean, one is that it's not an aristocratic class, and you know, although there's some people who've inherited their wealth, a lot of people have earned it. A lot of people have gotten their power from institutional affiliations, and therefore it's a much more transient form of power, and people can be in and out of this group fairly quickly. If we'd had this conversation 5 weeks ago, the CEO of Bear Stearns would have been in this superclass. He's not in this superclass anymore. If you'd done this conversation, you know, 30 years ago and you looked at international elites, most of the members would have been from the public sector. By far, the biggest group in the superclass today are from the private sector, and their power is concentrating. So, you know, take two examples. If you take the 50 biggest financial institutions in the world, they've got assets of about $48.5 trillion, which is about a third of all assets out there. If you take the 250 largest companies in the world, they have sales equal to about a third of global GDP. So that's 300 organizations that are responsible for a huge portion of the world's economic activity and have the resources to influence regulatory practices or governments in enormous ways, in some of the ways that Jeff described. And we've seen what can happen with the recent financial crisis, where they can keep the regulators away until they need them, and then they can get helped out in a way that the average homeowner in the United States or elsewhere can't get helped out.
Well, Jeff, you know, go ahead.
Yeah, there are two problems here. One is a language problem. We still have not developed the language to describe what David and I are talking about. For example, here in America, we have this notion that we're competing against the Chinese. So it's the Chinese threat. But when you look at that Chinese threat, it turns out that the commissars in China are providing the cheap labor, and the capitalists in America and other places are providing the technology and the financing. So is this a Chinese threat, or is it something else that we haven't got a name for yet? And I think it's really important that we start discussing this and coming up with the right labels, because the old sort of Westphalian nation-state notions don't really apply here. The other problem is basic democracy. David and I think, agree that if you have a global economy, you need global institutions to regulate it and manage it. We have no global government.
Well, what about organizations like the WTO and agreements like NAFTA?
Yeah. Well, they are attempts at it. But the problem with them is that there is no democracy. So the same elites that we are talking about are the ones who run the WTO, the NAFTA arrangements, et cetera, the IMF. They come and go, as David said, but the basic class power structure remains. So here's the problem. The average citizen has even less access to the WTO or to the World Bank or to the IMF than he or she has to their own government. I mean, we have, in the United States, we have problems of democracy. And so it is very difficult to imagine that if we create new institutions without something else going on, that somehow or other we can democratize them. That's why I think, I'm of the first school that David mentioned. I think we ought to go very slow on globalization. We're not completely globalized yet. We are globalizing. We ought to go slow now and work out the institutions that we need in order to manage this. Because otherwise, the trends that we see in terms of the maldistribution of power and income and wealth, they're just going to continue.
Yeah, I think, you know, the discussion that we're having here is a really interesting discussion because we start out in the same place. We see that there is a problem. We have slightly different approaches to how you address it. And my sense is that globalization is not a trend that's going to be reversible, and it's not something we can opt out of. And so there's much greater urgency to getting global institutions that work. But I agree with Jeff, they don't right now. And
I think Jeff's point was that you can't change globalization, but the benefits have to be.
Well, I agree with the point. The question is, how do you get there, and how do you ensure democracy? And the reality is that you can only pull back from globalization so far. The companies are going to continue to operate in a global sphere, and so consequently, you're going to need a counterbalance for them. You know, you opened with a question, which was, you know, have these superclasses made governments obsolete? Mm-hmm. And I would argue that it's the gradual obsolescence of the governments, the decline of the Westphalian system that Jeff was talking about, that has actually created the void that the superclass are filling.
Well, I want to ask you a question about that. You know, if these global elites, if the superclass is flourishing at the expense of, let's say, the working class, the workers of the world, what's the role for government? Has government got a role in this?
Well, government is the prize, so far, in this sense. The global elites still need government. There's no global army. And mostly, the global elites rely on the U.S. Army. I mean, that's the way the geopolitics of the current situation works out. But I think there's a way to think about this that's a little different than just being faced with the stark options of globalization or somehow trying to stop it. And that is, in Europe, for example, you have an interesting intermediate step, and that is the European Union was a continental effort at bringing people together and integrating that. Now they're struggling with democracy in Europe, but it seems to me that one can start thinking about the way to, the strategy for dealing with this by starting not with the globe, and quite frankly, I don't know how you democratize 6 billion people and, you know, more than 200 countries, but I can imagine how we begin to create a cross-border politics that would bring elites under some some control in regions. And that's why at the end of my book I talk about North America and NAFTA as NAFTA was the template for a lot of this stuff. And now I think there's a possibility that if we develop a politics of not of the elites, but a democratic politics across the borders of North America, we could begin to develop a model somewhat similar to what they're struggling with in Europe. And I think somewhat similar to what people are going to be struggling with in the cone of South America and other places in the world.
Okay, we'll continue with the conversation, but we are going to take a break right now. We're talking with David Rothkopf and Jeff Foe. Don't go away, we have much more to discuss. First, a short break.